It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you chemist, author, and public speaker, Bob Barefoot.
At the beginning of the 20th century, 3% of Americans got cancer. 3%. And there was one scientific publication on biological calcium at the turn of the century. They had discovered that calcium was the element that produced the electrical power for the heart to beat. So they said it was crucial. They said biological calcium or dietary calcium must be crucial to the human health. And that was right at the turn of the century. By the middle of the 20th century, in 1950, there were a few more publications on calcium, just a few, all suggesting the importance of dietary calcium, and cancer at that time struck 20% of Americans got cancer in 1950. The dietary maximum for calcium was set by the men of wisdom. They called it recommended daily allowance, or RDAs. In the 1950, they said 650 milligrams of calcium per day, anything more could be toxic. Whoa. By 1972, the year that President Nixon declared war on cancer, cancer had risen to 27% of Americans. And more scientific research was suggesting the importance of dietary calcium. So the maximum, the recommended daily allowance, was upped from 650 to 800 milligrams a day with the warning, anything more could be toxic. By 1982, 30% of Americans were getting cancer. And dietary calcium was raised to 1,000 milligrams a day because it was becoming quite popular. My gosh, calcium has something to do with human health. By 1999, 38% of Americans get cancer. And in 1998, the year previous, there were 19,700 scientific publications on calcium. That meant 20,000 scientists were studying calcium. The result is, you turn on your TV set, you see calcium added, calcium fortified. You can't go a week without hearing about calcium now. And just a few years back, nobody even knew what calcium was. They responded by raising the recommended daily allowance. It is now 1,500 milligrams a day with a precaution, anything more could be toxic. Of course, we're all rooting for 2,000 by the year 2000, even though anything more could be toxic. Do you know that by the year 2020, 50% of Americans will get cancer? And before the end of the next century, 100% will get cancer. The war's been lost. We have a disease called Alzheimer's that did not exist 60 years ago, and now almost 5 million Americans have Alzheimer's, a disease that didn't exist. In the past 20 years, diabetes has gone up 400%. Name me a disease that we're winning the war. Can't be done. We're not winning any war on any disease, apparently. Now, why we're talking about calcium is quite simple. I ask you to ask yourself, what am I, okay? And if you look in the mirror and say, what am I chemically? I know all of you will say, water. And the young ones will say, well, that's H2O. They like to use letters. H2O. Anybody hear of H2O? What's that? Hydrogen and oxygen. You're 78% hydrogen and oxygen. Now, if you add the gas nitrogen and carbon in the form of CO2 and methane, you are actually 96% gas. The 4% that's left over regulates your whole body. That's who you are, is what's left over. And what's left over, almost half of it's calcium. Calcium not only provides the electrical power for your heartbeat, calcium is crucial in DNA replication. A DNA is a double helix strand that is your blueprint to stay young, your blueprint for body repair. And DNA only works if it's laying in a cloud of calcium. So you can't even get better unless you have calcium in your system. The little calcium ion is so tough that it latches onto 7 nutrients and 1 water outside every cell and pulls it in the nutrient channel and feeds the cell. Detaches, goes back, gets 7 more, 1 water, pulls it in the cell. It feeds you. But the most important thing that calcium does is it douses acid. Water douses a flame. Calcium douses acid. And that's important because acid drives out oxygen. So the more calcium you have, the more oxygen you have. And we're critters of oxygen. So if you want to be healthy with oxygen, you have to have a lot of calcium in your system. So calcium is so important. There are literally hundreds of biological functions, and in the book, The Calcium Factor, we talk about them. So you can learn all about the hundreds of reasons why calcium is important, but don't do it without looking in the mirror and saying, I am a calcium critter. If people came from outer space and said, what are you? They'd say, you're a calcium critter. So calcium is crucial to your life. They have discovered that over 157 diseases are caused by calcium deficiency. And within about 20 years, that number will grow to over 500 diseases, all caused by one thing, lack of calcium. You have to replace the calcium. The problem we have in America is by the time you're 35, you have more calcium going out than going in. Therefore, you become a city. You have no oxygen, and you start getting all these diseases. And it keeps going up, 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 and up. Now, in 1982, I met a man called Dr. Carl Risch. I was a chemist, and I met a man called Dr. Carl Risch. And Carl Risch, when he was a child, he remembers because his dad was so rich that they had steak and eggs for breakfast. He said they had steak and soup for lunch, and they had steak and potatoes washed down with champagne for supper almost every day. And they were the most miserable, sickest family in the world. They were sick, sick, sick. And they died very young. When his grandmother died at 58, Carl rebelled and said, that's it. I'm not going to do what my dad says. So his dad had one trait, and that was he was a German, and every year on his birthday he would drink a quart of buttermilk. So Carl started drinking buttermilk, but he said he almost died. So he switched to regular milk and started drinking milk. And by gosh, he started feeling really good. Then the 1929 stock crash came, wiped his father out. They had no money. They went to a fishing village, and they had to unload fish off the ships just to live. Guess what they had for breakfast? Fish and eggs. You know what they had for lunch? Fish and soup. And for supper, fish and vegetables from the garden and milk from Daisy. And he said within 3 months, his family had never been so healthy. It was incredible, he said. Diet? He says, apparently, Grandma was right. You are what you eat, and you are what you don't eat. So when he became a doctor in 1952, he decided to ask all his patients the simple question. Do you drink milk? If your answer was yes, he said, I am going to put you in category 1. If your answer was no, he would ask you a second question. If you don't drink milk, do you like it? Or do you hate it? What's the deal? And some people would say, well, I drink the odd glass, I don't mind it. Oh, you're category 2. And if you said, I don't drink it, I don't like it, you know, it gives me phlegm, I have allergies, or I have lactose intolerance, then he said, you're category 3. By the time he had 2,000 patients, guess what happened? Category 1 was healthier than category 2, was healthier than category 3. Now, if we go out into the city of Albuquerque and we do a survey, we're going to find that category 1 is healthier than category 2. It'll work wherever you go because it's not the milk, it's the calcium. The more calcium they have. So he asked all his patients in category 1, how much are you drinking and how much are you eating? And he added up all the calcium, and it come out to be over 2,000 milligrams a day. Now remember in 1950, the recommended daily allowance for calcium was 650 milligrams. These people were taking 4 times as much and they were healthy. And in category 2, it was about 60 milligrams a day. In category 3, it was 370 milligrams a day. So he said, the more calcium they're consuming, the healthier they are. So I'm going to give my unhealthy patients calcium. How much? 2,000 milligrams a day. He said, Bob, within a week, I had 2,000 constipated patients. But he says, we all knew that if you're constipated, you take milk of magnesia, which is magnesium. So to the regimen, he added about 600 milligrams of magnesium, and then he said, you do not give minerals without vitamins, and the vitamin for calcium is vitamin D. Now your intestine is lined with what we call VDR receptors, vitamin D receptors. And if they're full with 5,000 international units, which is 1/10 of a milligram, which is 12 times the RDA, if they're full, you absorb 20 times as much calcium and about 10 times as much other nutrients. So he added 5,000 IU vitamin D. 1952, he became a medical maverick. They didn't know what to do with him. He was the very first doctor in North America exceeding the recommended daily allowance by huge quantities. Today, if a doctor did what he did, in 3 weeks he would lose his hospital privileges, and 3 weeks later he would lose his license. They don't put up with it. You got to do as you're told or you're out. Back then they didn't know what to do with this man, so they let him go, and they just called him names. Quack. Now they didn't really call him Quack, he said. It took him about 20 years to earn that rank. Yeah, you know, and I know you people think that that's an insult, right? Quackery. Is it an insult? Think about that. Well, I'm going to read you guys something here. Quackery is an honor for the men who study science, okay? You know why? Well, let me just point something out to you, okay? We've had some famous quacks in the history of mankind, okay? Real famous quacks. You know who they were? William Hagen. He was the very first doctor to realize that blood was pumped from the heart out to the body extremities. For that theory, they took his license away and called him a quack. Don't be ridiculous, they said. So the very first doctor that thought the heart pumped blood lost his license and was called a quack. William Röntgen, he was called a quack. Now, William Röntgen discovered X-rays and built an X-ray machine. And why was he a quack? Well, they feared his invention would, quote, this is the AMA, invade the privacy of the bedroom. William Tenner was the very first doctor who developed vaccine against smallpox. He was called a quack and strongly criticized for supposedly cruel and inhumane experiments on children. My hero is Dalton, the father of chemistry. 1800, he came up with this radical theory called the atomic theory. He said everything's made up of atoms. Are you out of your mind? He lost his tenure to teach at the university. They fired him. They kicked him out. They called him a quack. Don't be silly. 50 years later, they were still debating it, but most scientists said it was a nonsensical theory. At the turn of the century, half the scientists said atomic theory was right and the other half didn't. We had guys like Albert Einstein and Max Planck, the father of physics, all saying the atomic theory was correct, and we had all the leaders of all the universities saying, no, it isn't, and they were fighting him. Now, Albert Einstein, he had the audacity to come up with what we call the theory of relativity. And you've heard about it, but the bottom line is, when he wrote the publication, the scientists at the time were so appalled by it that they all got together at huge expense, hundreds of them, and they wrote a scientific publication called 100 Against Albert Einstein. And when Albert went to present his paper in 1904, their paper was being presented right after his. And just before Albert got up to present his paper on relativity, a young man in the front row jumped up and says, Albert, aren't you going to address what's coming next? 100 Against Albert Einstein? He says, do I have to? He said, yes. He said, well, here's the way it is, son. And this guy was only about 23 at the time, and he called this guy son. He said, if they had been right, one of them would have been enough. They don't need 100. So he got a standing ovation, and it sort of took the wind right out of their sails. And then in 1945, the Royal Canadian Air Force took an atomic clock and flew it around the world, and it lost 7 seconds, proving his theory was correct. And since that time, they proved it and proved it and proved it. That really velocity and time are related inversely. But anyways, bottom line is, he was a quack. My hero, Albert Einstein, was a quack. There was a man, a doctor, and he's a famous quack because in 1844, his wife gave birth and died. You see, in 1844, one of the 3 women would die giving birth to babies in hospitals. One of the 3. Do you want to go to a hospital and have a baby? But if you stayed home, 1 in 1,000 died. And Dr. Semmelweis said, it must be something we're doing. Because if they stay home, they don't die. And he said, when we touch them, you see, back in those days, the doctors didn't wash. They came in with street clothes. They usually did autopsies just before all of that, okay? And what happened to them was, they had germs and viruses on their hands. So they didn't know about it, but Dr. Semmelweis said, listen, there must be something we can't see, so let's scrub our hands. Now, in Budapest, this major hospital started scrubbing the hands, and guess what happens? The women stopped dying. As a matter of fact, only 1 in 2,000 women would die, so 7 other major hospitals took suit. But 5 years before this, your American Medical Association was created, and they dictated that any doctor who believes in spooks, things you can't see, will lose his license. And they told all American doctors, if you wash your hands, you lose your license for quackery. They called it spook quackery. Anyways, they went over to Europe. They lobbied all the other medical associations in Canada, Britain, Germany, France. They descended on Budapest, and 3 weeks later, Simon Weiss found himself in a mental institute where he mysteriously, quote, committed suicide. They wiped him out real fast. Doctors in America went back to not washing their hands. 40 years later, millions and millions of American deaths later, 2 men, Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister, the father of germ theory, they had taken microscopes and hooked up cameras to them, and they took pictures of the germs. They then went to the American Medical Association and said, we have pictures of Simon Weiss's spooks. Please let the doctors wash their hands. This is 1884. The American Medical Association said, we need further proof. We have to study it further. And so they would not let doctors wash their hands. By the turn of the centuries, the whole world was washing their hands. American doctors washed their hands in the closet. If they got caught, they lose their license. American doctors were not allowed to wash their hands until World War I. Now, let me ask you, in the 80 years where American doctors didn't wash their hands, how many millions of Americans died? That edict from the AMA killed millions and millions of Americans, and they're still doing it. I can go on and explain how their policies today are killing millions of Americans, and they make a rule, you cannot challenge them because you do not have medical freedom. Yeah, back in 1876, they were all getting together to form a constitution, and they did it by drafting and having everything suggested, approved, and rewritten and written. And one doctor sat there and said, okay guys, I want medical freedom. And he was the only doctor. He was the Surgeon General, Benjamin Rush, Dr. Benjamin Rush, the Surgeon General, said, I want medical freedom. And what that means is all the people can choose any medicine they want, and any doctor can practice any medicine he wants. He also wanted you to have religious freedom. The majority wanted you to become Quakers. They had a vote. By one vote, they decided to give you religious freedom. Dr. Benjamin Rush won. On medical freedom, he lost by 2 votes because Washington was lobbied and changed his vote. And he said, George, you're going to pay for this. And you know what happened to poor George Washington? He did pay for it. A few years later, he got the flu, woke up with headaches, flu-like symptoms, and they did what they did in those days. He let his blood. Well, when you let blood, your blood pressure drops, and he felt pretty good for a couple hours. But he got sick again, so they let more blood. That made him sicker, so they let more blood. That made him sicker, so what did they do? Well, the doctors of the day liked using mercury packs. So they packed his mouth with mercury compounds. They filled them up until it blistered, and the idea was the blisters would pop and the poisons would come out. That was the theory. Well, that didn't work, so they let out more blood. That didn't work, so they filled his anus with mercury, pumped it up there, and he was pleading for them to kill him by that time. Now, all the other doctors weren't allowed in because there was no medical freedom. So they let out more blood. They let out 7 pints of blood, enough to kill an elephant. George didn't die. He was killed by the AMA, and so on and so on. Bottom line is these are all true stories. Anyways, guys, to get back to the reality of the calcium, in 1982, when Dr. Reese had come to me, he had a stack of paper. It was very heavy and thick, 8 inches high, and he had another little stack of paper about a 1/4 inch high, and official autopsies, it said, and he said, I want you to read this. And not the big stack, the little stack, and I didn't want to read it, but he convinced me to read the last paragraph of the last page, and it was 5 women's autopsies, and they died. One said died of unknown causes, died peacefully. The one I liked the best was died with a smile on her face. The autopsy showed no disease. So Dr. Reese said to me, okay, what'd they die from? And I said, good health. He said, no, what'd they die from? What disease? I said, autopsies would have found disease. They had no disease. Now, The big tall stack was medical records from the Mayo Clinic, University of Rochester, University of New York, University of Toronto. These people were certified terminal cancer patients. The woman they gave 6 weeks to live lived 17 years. Another one they gave 3 months to live lived 12 years. I said, wow, this guy has cured cancer. And he says, calm down, calm down. I got 104 more autopsies to show you back at the office. He had 109 autopsies showing that there was no cancer in people that medicine said were full of cancer and dying from it. So he had definitely cured cancer. I said, what did you do? He said, I calcium factored them. He said, when I started giving all my patients in 1952 all this calcium, I had almost immediate results. First off, pain went away. He said, I had rheumatoid arthritis patients in wheelchairs that 3 months later were out playing golf. He said, I had 6 diabetic patients that were off their insulin in 6 months. I had terminal heart patients that suddenly had good tickers. And he says that I had 6 terminal cancer patients that suddenly were benign. And all I did was calcium factor them. I had no idea what I was doing, but the AMA won't let me publish. They said it's too simple. We will not let you degrade us by coming up with this simple theory that calcium is important in human health. Anyways, in 1962, he was allowed to present his paper at the Max Planck Institute. And he presented it to 4,000 people, got a standing ovation, but while he was presenting it, he told me that there was a heckler in the back of the room, heckling in German, and the heckler really wasn't heckling, he was prodding him on because his name was Dr. Otto Warburg. And Dr. Warburg won 2 Nobel Prizes for cancer. What he discovered was, he discovered what causes cancer. Did you know there were Nobel Prizes for the discovery of what causes cancer? You don't think anybody knows, and how come they're giving them Nobel Prizes for the discovery? He said cancer was caused by anaerobism, which means if you drive the oxygen out, we can give cancer. He took 47 species of animals, dogs, fish, cats, horses, all kinds, mice, animals, 47, and within 30 days, he induced cancer in all of them by injecting their body fluids with acid. See, acid drives oxygen out. He claimed that he could give you cancer in less than 3 days. All the healthy people, I'll give you cancer in 3 days. For this, he won the Nobel Prize. And he said, Dr. Reese, what you did was the opposite. Calcium douses acid. When you give them the calcium factor, you douse the acid, you fill them with oxygen, and the oxygen terminated the cancer. It's simple. Dr. Reese liked this and said, let's collaborate on the book, The Calcium Factor. Unfortunately, Otto Warburg was quite old by then, and he didn't make it. And Dr. Reese spent a lot of years looking for a calcium chemist. In 1982, he found me. And there I am. Oh, yes, this man cured cancer. I will help him. But only on the condition that we keep it simple. I said, my grandmother has to be able to understand what we're talking about. I'm not going to draw genes and all that. Look, you told me the key. Calcium cures cancer. How simple can it be? He said, okay, I'll let you keep it simple, but it has to be scientific. In other words, you have to use scientific fact. I said, okay, fine. So I went to the libraries, and guess what? There was all kinds of information on the importance of calcium. Scientists were suggesting that calcium was the key to cancer. Scientists were suggesting, I even saw one scientific publication where they took a cancer tumor the size of an orange, black and ugly, they cut it in half and they put it in 2 beakers. Then what they did was they put body fluids, kept it body temperature for 4 days, but before they started, they put a pinch of calcium in one of the beakers. 4 days later, when you look at the pictures, you see the one without the calcium is the size of a grapefruit, it had grown 4 times the size, and the one with the calcium was the size of a pea. So in 1982, if you joined me in the library and you had cancer, I guarantee you would say, give me those calcium salts. They apparently prevent cancer.
This is the end of Side A. Stop the tape at this point and turn the cassette over to hear Side B.
Now I'm going to leap into 1999. Well, let's go back to October 1998. Okay, because in October 98, the New York Times had a huge publication, and it was called Calcium Takes Its Place as a Superstar of Nutrients. And what it says was, research suggests it may play a role in controlling blood pressure, easing premenstrual syndrome, and calcium helps to prevent cancer. Prevents cancer. The New York Times in 1998, October 13th edition, says calcium prevents cancer. I thought, wow. Dr. Reese lost his license for saying the same thing in 1982. Then, in January, the Arizona Republic comes out with an article entitled, Calcium Reduces Tumor in Colon, study says. They say that dietary calcium can keep you from getting tumors and reduce the cancer. And they report that this was a quote from the New England Journal of Medicine. That's the doctor's magazines. The doctor's magazine is telling them that calcium prevents cancer, and this newspaper is reporting it. Now, if you think that's over, it's just the beginning. In the 1999 February issue of Reader's Digest, in a big article on the superstar nutrient calcium, says that high blood pressure could be eliminated with calcium supplements, totally, within weeks. That PMS could be eradicated with calcium supplements. They even suggest that almost 95% of hysterectomies aren't necessary if you give calcium supplements. And then the coup d'etat comes. They talk about cancer. And they say, according to a quote from the Journal of the American Medical Association, that calcium-rich products, 1,500 milligrams a day of calcium, convert and improve the cell growth towards normal. That's the cell growth of cancer will go to normal if you get 1,500 milligrams of calcium a day. The Reader's Digest has 200 lawyers. They're only quoting the doctor's magazines. The doctor's magazines are saying calcium cures cancer, according to that. Now, it's not over, because we have the U.S. News and World Report, May 3rd edition, Calcium's Powerful Mysterious Ways. And this is a neat article because it says, researchers are increasingly finding that the humble mineral calcium plays a major role in warding off major diseases, from high blood pressure to colon cancer. You name the disease, and calcium is beginning to have a place in all diseases. Holy cow. And on and on and on and on. So in other words, calcium prevents cancer, according to the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Phoenix Republic, the Reader's Digest, the U.S. World News Report, who are recording information from the New England Journal of Medicine and the Journal of the American Medical Association. Now, why aren't the doctors telling you that calcium prevents cancer? Because they sure are. The scientific community has come full circle. So here we are in 1982. Calcium cures cancer. I couldn't believe it. It was so simple. And I'm looking for information. I said, what we'll do is, if you give those people calcium and reverse the cancer, then let's go and find, do you eat calcium? Because if you eat calcium, you won't get cancer. So let's find where people eat a lot of calcium and we won't find cancer, right? Simple. We looked and looked and looked and couldn't find nothing because nobody wrote information on what people eat. Because diet, they say diet and disease, are you crazy? Diet has nothing to do with disease in 1982. Well, in 1999, the FDA claimed that 82% of all disease is caused by diet. So diet must have something to do with disease. But anyways, I was frustrated and I found myself in a barber's chair. And you go to your barber when you need help. This barber turned out to be my future father-in-law. And I said to him, I can't find this information. And he asked me specifically what it was, and I told him. He said, well, I know why you can't find it. He says, the reason you can't find it is because you are a stupid scientist. And I said, oh, and I suppose a smart barber could find it? And he said, yep. I said, care put your money where your mouth is? He says, I got 20 bucks on the table. And remember, this is 1982, that's like 100 bucks. I said, okay, I matched it and thought, boy, there's a fast 20. He waddles over to his yellow wall. Now, National Geographics have yellow binding, and he had, since the turn of the century, collected every issue. And he went up and down and up and down. He said, oh, here it is, and he walks out. He took my 20 bucks and I got his magazine. January 1973. It's an article by the National Geographic on centurions. 4 cultures all over the world. They have the Georgians high in the mountains. They had the Azerbaijanis high in the mountains, the Hunzas high in the mountains, and the Titicaca Indians of Peru high in the mountains. About 10,000 miles apart. This guy's 103, looks like he's 60. He has a father who's 129, and a grandfather who's 150. Now, if we said that to the AMA, they would say, foul, foul. The oldest woman's in Pennsylvania and she's 117 and she has a birth certificate. Show me the guy's birth certificate. Well, I ask you, if you were 150, what year were you born? 1849, right? Well, if you're born in 1849, guys, you would have to wait 20 years to get your certificate because they didn't issue birth certificates till 1869. So how can we use this stupid measure that didn't exist? These guys are. Because you see, he also has, this fella here also has a grandson who's 57 years old with a birth certificate from Chicago. So if we take the Chicago birth certificate, great-great-great-great-great-grandpa has to be at least 150. Now, how old should you live? In America today, the average person lives to be 75. A woman is 76, a man 74. They don't expect to live much longer. How long should you expect to live is the question. Well, let's go back to when this guy was born, 1849, okay? If we're in Albuquerque in 1849 and we're talking to all the people there and we ask the question, what's life expectancy in Albuquerque in 1849? You know what it was? 42 years old. If you made it to 50, you had to be the oldest man in the world. They couldn't believe it. But if we went to Albuquerque in 1899, 100 years ago, what's the answer going to be then? 49. If you made it to 60, you'd have to be the oldest man in the world. Then came the refrigerator, electricity, and that's fruits and vegetables all year round. And we gradually bumped it up, and we're now at 76. But should we expect 76? Well, I'm glad you're saying no, because, you see, the Bible says, Genesis 6:3, man shall not be immortal, but man shall live to be 120. Okinawa is 105. Everybody makes it to 105. Some make to 150. Oops, without American birth certificates. But they make it. The bottom line is, how old should you be? Well, the simple way of resolving the issue is to become an alien and say, okay, we're going to look at all living things. And we're going to find an animal factor. The animal factor, if you have a dog, he matures at 2, dies at 14. 14 over 2 is 7. If you have a horse, matures at 3, dies at 21. 21 over 3 is 7. Rabbit, 11 months, 6 years, 7. A hamster, 5.5 months, 3 years, 7. A human, 18, 127. Whoops. But you're settling on 3.5 as your factor. We're the only animal in the world that has a 3.5 factor. If we'd measured this in 1849, it would have been 2. And then in the turn of the century, it would have been 3. It's now 4. I guarantee you, in the year 2099, when I ask the question, it's going to be answered. 150 is what they'll all expect to live, because they will be living to 150, not with the bodies that you're looking at. Because you see, the DNA, full of calcium, keeps replicating and replicating, and you don't grow old. They don't look like George Burns at 100, for Pete's sakes. These guys, you know, I got pictures in this National Geographic. A guy is 118 and he's having a sword fight. A guy 108 is riding bucking broncos. They don't grow old. They do their work. What have they got in common? The calcium factor. Couldn't wait to look. You see, except for the Japanese, every one of them is above 8,500 feet. The only source of water is melting glaciers. When the glacier melts, a ground-up rock comes with it. The water looks turbid and milky. It looks just like milk, and they call it milk of the mountains. Every quart of the milk of the mountains contains 18,000 milligrams of calcium, or 18 times the RDA of calcium. And they drink 3-4 quarts a day, and when they put this milk on their crops, the potatoes and the tomatoes, everything's loaded with calcium. And we add up, and we look at calcium, magnesium, potassium, all the goodies. And we say, how much are these people taking? How much do the people all around the world take that live to be 100 routinely, never get sick, to have no cancer, no diabetes, no heart disease, age at half the rate we do? How much are they eating? The answer is 100 times the RDA of everything. Those RDAs, as Dr. Reese calls them, are recommended death allowances, because they're so low they guarantee you're going to be sick. What this means is there is no such thing as a vitamin and a mineral that are toxic. Because they have 100 times, and their side effect is prolonged life, prolonged health, and prolonged youth. Boy, give me them side effects. Let's have a drug in America with them side effects. And it's nonsense. Have you ever heard of anybody, any of your friends dying from calcium? I mean, don't be stupid. They got us believing anything they want us to believe just by telling us. Well, remember that vitamin D that allows you to absorb 10 times the nutrients? Every hour in the sun in your bikinis, you produce 50,000 units. You know what that is? That's over 100 times the RDA. The recommended daily allowance is 400 micrograms, international units. You know what that is? That's 1/100th of a gram. I mean, 400 is ridiculous. It takes 40,000, to make a milligram. 40,000 makes 1 milligram, 47,000. They tell you 400. So they tell you can only have 1/100th of a milligram. Could be toxic. Well, how come then your VDRs are 5,000? How come you produce 50,000 when you go out in the sun? And when you go out in the sun, something else happens to you. You produce inosol triphosphate. That regulates all your minerals. And when you go out in the sun, something else happens to you. Guess where God put your pituitary gland? Smack behind your eyes. Where did he put your pineal gland? Smack behind your eyes. Where did he put your hypothalamus gland? Smack behind your eyes. And guess what? They only work with full spectrum light. Got to take off your glasses. Bottom line is, when they work, you produce all the correct hormones, all the correct things, and your body's balanced. So if you stay out of the sun, you're going to be one sick cookie. You take a pretty flower out of the sun, it wilts. If you take a pretty woman out of the sun, she wilts just as fast for the same reasons. You can't do it. God didn't know you would wear glasses. He didn't know you would wear clothes. He thought you were supposed to be naked in the sun. And that's how you evolved. And when you are, you're healthy. These people all do this. It's the common denominator. And they're all over. There's the Vilcabamba Indians in Ecuador, and then you look at them Okinawans, my gosh, millions of them, all living long with no cancer, no heart disease. I also saw in 1982 a picture of a Canadian Eskimo on the front cover of the National Geographic. And the article was on the fact that here's an Eskimo that eats 78% blubber, and he doesn't have heart disease. He doesn't have cancer. He doesn't have diabetes. The only Eskimos that are sick are the ones we feed. And they got all our diseases. And the ones we don't feed have no diseases. Now, doesn't that sort of indicate to you that our diet is causing our sickness? Margarine is lethal. It's full of cis-trans fat. When they do studies with twins, the twin that takes margarine has 4 times the cholesterol count that the twins on the butter. They've got you brainwashed into thinking that margarine's healthy. And every scientist knows it's lethal. Did you know that the Harvard School of Medicine did a massive study for 7 years on 67,000 women in one group and 67,000 in a control group? They gave them fat, man-made fat, margarine, corn oil, vegetable oil. When you squeeze corn, there's no oil in it. You can make oil from the carpet, so I can put carpet oil on your salad if you'd like, but I can make it from anything. But it's man-made, and I make it different because I don't want it to go rancid. I want it to last. So man-made oil isn't the same. Well, they discovered after 7 years that the women on the man-made fat had increased breast cancer by 70%. And the control group that had animal fat, olive oil, everything was natural fat, reduced breast cancer, reduced it by 50%. Almost a 5-fold difference in breast cancer, depending upon which fat you eat. Now, it doesn't end there. There's more. Did you know that they did the study on women's breast cancer? And it was the National Institute of Health in Finland? And this is a prestigious study, okay? This study was done and concluded in January of this year, okay? And after they did the study, newspapers reported it. You had front page titles like this one, A Glass of Prevention. Let me read to you what the study concluded after doing tens of thousands of women and breast cancer. The report concludes there is an overwhelming association between the high consumption of milk and the prevention of breast cancer compared to any other factor there is. They found that if a woman would take a quart of milk a day, she would reduce breast cancer 1,000%. They said it didn't matter if it was 2% skimmed or whole, just like the British study. Didn't matter if it was 2% skimmed or whole. It's the calcium factor. They said, therefore, the more calcium you consume, the less breast cancer you get. This study said the more calcium you consume, the less heart disease you get. And the more calcium you consume, the less diabetes, the less lupus, the less multiple sclerosis. Boy, they're all related to acidosis driving oxygen out of the body. Dr. Otto Warburg was absolutely correct. So the things you've been told, the things you have been told are not true. Almost everything they tell you. Now, who's telling you this? The drug industry. It is not the doctors speaking. They only reiterate what they're told to tell you. The doctors are not fools. They're actually on our side. They would prescribe vitamins and nutrients, but if they do, they lose their license. So you can't blame the doctors. You can blame the AMA, whose 87% of their board members become board members of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and 92% of those board members end up with multi-million-dollar pensions from the drug industry. They control each other. They are each other. They are one and the same. Now, I've saved the best for last, and that was because in 1982, we were really mesmerized by the fact that if all these cultures are at high level, above 8,000 feet, how can you have 4 million Japanese at sea level, not sick, no cancer, with the same symptoms? But as soon as we went in and looked at the calcium factor, we found it was constant. You see, Okinawa is about 327 islands, about 157 of them are inhabited, and they are islands of coral reefs. Coral reefs are calcium carbonate, so they live on an island of calcium. When the calcium weathers, you get calcium in the air, calcium in your hair, calcium is everywhere, and they even eat it. So 540 some years ago, they discovered that when the chickens pecked at the coral reefs, they would have twice as many eggs, and the eggs were delicious. They found that when the cows licked the reefs, they would have twice as much milk, and it was delicious. And so they started looking at that, and all reefs will disintegrate when they weather, and it drops off and forms what we call coral sand. In Hawaii, these sands get washed out to the ocean by the big wave action. But in Okinawa, they don't have the wave action, so they just drop down. Well, these Japanese started digging them up and feeding them to the chickens who had twice as many eggs. They fed them to the cows who had twice as much milk, and then they put them on their crops, and some of their crops went up 300% more rice. The Japanese culture for 4,000 years has been saying, the islands of Okinawa shall cure the world, and nobody knows about it. There's millions of tons of this stuff. They're shipping it around the world. Mainland Japan has got it now. There's 17 million Japanese take it every day. They want to grow to be 105 with no disease. 44 million Chinese. Millions of people in Sweden, France, Germany, England are taking coral calcium. It's gone there long before America. It's finally come to the United States, and there's only about 250,000 people taking it. But that leads to some pretty big disasters because, you see, 50% of the people that take it will stand up and give you a testimonial. And you're going to find this. Once you start taking the coral, people will talk to you about what happened. I'm going to be on the Oprah Winfrey Show, and there's going to be 50 million Americans learning about coral overnight. You wait and see. It's going to happen. They can't stop us. It's international. Russian doctors are prescribing coral calcium to all their patients. Did you know that? In Germany, they're prescribing coral calcium to their patients. Medical doctors are doing this. It's going to happen in America, too. American doctors will be, in the next century, prescribing coral calcium to all their people. It's a piece of the Garden of Eden. See, that coral also has 60 other elements: copper, chromium, yttrium, selenium. My gosh, what do you guys want? It's got everything in it. And the more you have, the better you are. Coral calcium has praseodymium and yttrium. And you know, they did scientific studies on praseodymium and yttrium. And you know what they discovered? They discovered that all the animals that eat praseodymium and yttrium double their lifespan. They live twice as long. And they did dozens of animals. And when I found that out in 1982, I said to myself, boy, I'm going to take praseodymium and yttrium. My wife's going to take it. My kids are going to take it. My friends and family. Everybody in the world I'm going to give yttrium to except my mother-in-law. My goal, my dream, and I have a dream, and that is to wake up one day to an America disease-free, no cancer, no diabetes, no heart disease. My grandchildren are not going to be suffering the ravages of cancer, diabetes, multiple sclerosis, because they don't need to. We know how today to cure the world. We're just not allowed to do it. So you people, they can't throw you all in jail for curing yourselves. So why don't you start with yourselves, cure your friends, cure your families, and it'll spread like wildfire. God bless you all.
This concludes the Barefoot presentation. It is important to note that when Mr. Barefoot refers to Dr. Risch's experience with milk, at that time, milk was whole milk, without antibiotics or hormone additives. Also, regarding the sun, although sunshine is important to the health, keep in mind the scientific evidence of ozone layer depletion and the risks this may represent. As a side note, you can get an indication of your current state of health and mineral deficiency by using a quick and inexpensive home-use saliva and pH test, which measures the level of acid or alkalinity of your body. Ask at your local health store or the person that gave you this tape. Now, please fast forward to the end of this tape.